Someone You Should Know, a program about people you know and even more that you don't. Hosted by Stuart Sax, veteran, husband, father, and grandfather. Now, here's your host, Stuart Sax.
Well, it's a Wednesday morning, it's 10 o'clock, and that means it's another edition of Someone You Should Know. Thanks for being with us, and thanks for all the comments that we get from week to week about how you enjoy the show, how you're sharing the show, liking the show. Please keep it up. Tell your friends about Someone You Should Know. Go back and look at some of the past programs. I was realized that I'm almost 400 episodes of this program over the last 7 years. It's been absolutely incredible. And we are brought to you today by our good friends over at No Sweat Experts. You know, it is never too early to make sure that your air conditioning and heating system is working properly. We're getting ready to transition from winter into spring. You want to make sure that your air conditioner system is up to par and all. And the folks over at No Sweat Experts will take good care of you. Trust me, they take good care of me. They'll take good care of you too. Well, I want to welcome a very special guest today, and I will tell you that I'm going to have to watch everything that I say on this show today because I have a real, true life investigative reporter. And if you say something wrong to an investigative reporter, it could come back to haunt you. So, Robert Riggs, welcome to Someone You Should Know.
So, Stuart, thank you. You're worried about me fact checking you, huh?
Yeah, yes. and who would have thought that what less than a decade ago we didn't even know what the phrase fact checking even meant?
Well, unfortunately, today truth is a commodity in short supply, so we need it.
And I mean, you have made a career out of it, really, because you probably see more variety of information and bogus reports and crap coming through the media and every which way, that you have made it a career of trying to find out what is right, what is wrong.
Well, of course, today it's like a fire hose, drinking from a fire hose. When my broadcast news career ended in 2008, the internet and the social had not taken hold like it has today, and where now anybody can claim they're an expert. And it really makes it difficult for the public, and it makes all of us vulnerable to disinformation.
Yes, and it just seems year after year, it seems to multiply. You know, I've often said to my wife and to our listeners and everything, I just don't understand when lying became in fashion. That it was okay, just say whatever you want to say, whether it's right or wrong, because you can either later endorse what you said as truth or just deny, or it was taken out of context, or write a retraction on page 85 or something. It's just that people are getting away with falsehoods instead of doing their due diligence, and when they say something, make it right the first time.
Yes. Well, I'm a product of Northeast Texas and East Texas. Uh, my father, uncles were all World War II veterans. My parents were children of the Depression. And it was always just drilled into me that the only thing you had was your word and your reputation and honesty. I mean, I heard it over and over. That's all you really have. And it's gone. It seems to be gone. I'm often asked as an investigative reporter, "Well, Robert, who do you trust?" Well, nobody until I can really check it out.
Yeah, and you started. Is this what you studied when you were growing up? When you went into college, I think you're a product of Texas A&M, correct?
Correct. I followed my uncle, who I'm named after there. He was in there in World War II, and his class, their junior year, got called to the war. And fortunately, he survived, came back, and finished on the GI Bill. But I, as a child, was fascinated with flight and flying, and I had If you went in my room, there were model airplanes suspended from the ceiling. I had gas-powered airplanes, uh, notebooks, scrapbooks, just loved it, breathed it, and learned to fly in high school, traded out work with a crop duster for flying lessons, and got appointed to the Air Force Academy. And you had to go in those days to your nearest air base for a flight physical. Lo and behold, found out I had astigmatism, and that ended that. So I went to Texas A&M and really kind of trying just to find myself, kid from East Texas. And I ended up, long story, but I ended up in architecture, studying architecture and construction. And it was a life-changing experience for me. In high school, I was not considered the most likely to succeed or most popular at all. Um, and I worked part-time. So I wasn't involved in a lot of extracurricular activities, played a little baseball, but at A&M, I really came out and I ran for student government. I was a student senator, became interested in politics. It was just an awakening for me in those days. And this was during Vietnam, the protest and everything else. And A&M was a military school. And those of us interested in politics were more interested in, well, how do we work within the system to change it? And so when I graduated, I went to Washington, D.C., and went to work for the senior member of Congress named Wright Patman.
Wow. Right away, I'm probably thinking like a lot of people that are watching and listening right now. Oh, wait a minute. He went from architecture and all to politics in Washington. That's kind of an interesting bridge to cross.
Well, my dad had the same reaction. You can imagine, working class in solo business, and I got worried one day. He showed up on campus unannounced, and that meant he had closed. He had a watch repair shop. That meant he'd closed his business. You close your business, you got no money coming in that day. But he'd come down and he went over to the architecture college because he knew I was trying to go to DC, and to ask, what's happened to my boy? 5 years of architecture, engineering, and he wants to go to Washington. And the dean of the college and everybody knew me very well. And they said, he's doing the right thing. This is good what he's doing. And then my dad was all on board, and was extremely then proud that I became a congressional staffer.
So what were your duties as a professional staffer when you got to Washington? What were some of your first assignments and duties?
Oh, it's interesting you say that because I arrived there with a 5-year architecture engineering degree, and I'm a gopher. You know, you're
Yeah.
looking. I'm a gopher, and but it was what I realized in hindsight later was all a test. It was a test. Can you do it? Can and one of the things that happened was that Wright Patman started the first Watergate investigation. Now, I'll tell you a little something about him. I arrived on Capitol Hill in his office in May of 1972. He'd been elected in 1929. And it was the days of the seniority system where the chairs of the committee went to whoever had outlived everybody. And uh, it was pretty dictatorial on those committees. Most of the chairmanships in the House were by Texans. And then later that system was thrown out. But I will say for that system, they got things done. Things really did move. And Sam Rayburn, who'd been one of his peers, had a old saying, the Speaker of the House from Texas, that you got to get along to go along.
Yeah.
But I arrived there, and he had started became the Watergate Committee, but it was the first Watergate investigation through the Banking Committee, trying to track where did illegal money that went to the Watergate burglars, where did it come from? How did it get into the president's political coffers for his campaign? And I was a researcher. And in those days, if you wanted something from the Library of Congress, the Securities and Exchange Commission, you had to go there in person and dig through files, and I mean mountains of files. Um, the card catalog in those days, if you remember the old Dewey Decimal System when you were in school and
Right, right.
catalogs, as I recall, I think there were 22,000 files, and so you'd be looking through that, everything else. And the Library of Congress back in the back there are stacks, and it's floor after floor. And I'm about 6'1", and my head would almost touch the ceiling. And you're back in there digging. There were nights I slept in the place. And the library staff was like, wanted to kick me out. And I was like, oh no, I've got an assignment here. I've got to get this done. And I work for Wright Patman, and they would go, oh, Chairman Patman, never mind. Do what you want to do. But I had a knack for just digging stuff out, and a curiosity. And eventually that led me to get appointed to the Joint Committee on Defense Production as a staff investigator. And I was a young kid from Texas, and fortunately I had a lot of senior people watching me that I worked through so I didn't get in trouble. And that committee began to take up things the Watergate Committee didn't have authority to investigate, and a lot of it involved bribery and slush funds. And our work led to the passage of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. But I had a top secret security clearance. Most of the staff in there were from the CIA and military intelligence. They wanted nothing to do with anything, the media, anything. And so there was a lot of focus on the committee. And so since I worked for the chairman, and that gave me a lot of power and cachet, dealt with the New York Times, Washington Post, CBS correspondence, that sort of thing. And that's where I really got interested in journalism.
And you were, and how old were you at this time?
Oh, what? 22, 23.
I mean, it's hard to believe that you got to Washington. All of a sudden, you've got this top security clearance, and you are digging to get the information. And folks, bear in mind, this is all long before we had the internet at our disposal. I mean, there was no Google.
Right.
There were platforms to just ask Alexa, tell me this. As Robert says, you had to dig. I remember going to libraries and digging through drawer after drawer just to do a project or a paper for school, because you had to collect all that information.
Yes.
You had to usually take notes longhand, then go home, sit down at the typewriter, and put it in some kind of form.
And back in those days too, newspapers, back issues were on microfiche, like film,
Right.
and you'd have to sit and look at a reader and look at it. It was a painstaking. But I also learned too that you had to talk to people, interview people. And now I must say that Mr. Patman's chief of staff, his name was Baron Ignatius Shacklet. He'd put himself through Harvard Law School in the Depression. He had worked for Army intelligence, World War II. He'd been in the Truman White House. He had incredible experience. And, he had a Napoleonic personality and was built like Napoleon, a fire plug too.
Yeah.
And he was quite a taskmaster. But fortunately, he took me under his arm and kept me out of trouble, gave me lots of good advice. I have to say that, I came in, I've been student government A&M, chairman of some committees on campus. I thought I was hot stuff, and I'm brash. And about the third week on the job, I accidentally insulted him. And I knew things were bad because we were standing in this huge secretarial pool, and every typewriter suddenly stopped. The room went silent, and I went, "Oh no, I'm about to be fired." And what happened? He assigned me this job that was awful, just awful, and I did it, got through it, and won his respect. But he really, really was my godfather there. And I always stress to students I work with and everybody, you need mentors. You need to be mentored by people who've got a lot of experience. Because I can remember walking into Mr. Patman's office and he was called chairman. He was chairman of 5 committees, and nobody called him by his first name, maybe a senior member, but it was always Mr. Chairman.
Mr.
And
Chairman.
I would go in with a stack of subpoenas that I'd made out, and the chairman would look up, he'd be signing them, and he would say, and Mr. and Shacklet would be standing there, and he would say, "Now, young man, I'm signing stuff. I don't know what I'm signing here. You're not going to get me in trouble here, are you?" And the chief of staff Shacklet would speak up and say, "Now, Mr. Chairman, you know that I would never, never let that happen. That won't happen." And off we'd go. So, but it was a great experience of just working with people, learning how to work with people. And I might say back in high school, my job has always put me in contact with adults, dealing with adults. And I really had learned how to communicate, personal communication skills, how to work with people.
So you weren't threatened by being around all of these older, mature, seasoned individuals in Washington. You're this young 20-year-old, 20 something that's asking all the questions. Did you ever feel uncomfortable in that role, or did you ever feel that you were making any of them uncomfortable in what you were doing?
No, and what was interesting, there was a group of young men and women my age, just like me, that had showed up in Washington at the same time working for senior members. And there must have been 2 dozen or more of us, and we all became friends, and we hung out together on weekends and everything else. And, you know, shared experiences, stories, what have you. Now, when I came into Mr. Patman's, my gosh, I guess he must have had, if you spread over the committees, there must have been 150 staff or more. And I'm at the bottom of the pyramid. And, your influence or power as a staffer is directly related to the access you have to the member, be it in Congress, be it the president of the United States, be it in a corporation. Close
Right.
you are to the big decision maker, you can ride their coattails of what you want to do. And my friends and I, we were all like challenged about, gosh, they don't know who I am. I'm just a nothing down here and stuff. Well, we figured out something. The members would go home on weekends to their districts, and they needed a ride to the airport, and they needed somebody there late Sunday night to pick them up. And we all began volunteering. Mr. Chairman, I'll be there. I'd take him to the airport, take his bags in, get him checked in, and I would be there Sunday night. And most of us would pass on parties or dates on Sunday nights, and we'd all be sitting and picking up our members. And guess what? Now we've got one-on-one time of with a member. Now they know who we are. They're asking us questions about our life, our interest, and that led me to once getting a call at, hey, the chairman wants you to go to the White House with him for a deal. So yeah, his wife is gone. So you know, so I can remember even later on, I'm a staffer on the Defense Committee, and I get a call like, "Hey, you need to get over here. The chairman wants you to take him downtown to an event." I'm like, Shack, that I call the chief of staff Shack, is from Shackle. Shack, wow, I'm really busy. I don't know if I have time for this. He says, "Young man, you created this monster. You get your butt over here and drive."
It-
So
Do, do you perceive, I'm going decades forward now. Do you perceive that same kind of rhetoric and that same kind of personality exists in Washington between the staffers and the people that they're working with, or has that eroded over the years?
I think it has eroded. I still have friends there that started with me, just as I described. They're now lobbyists, influential lobbyists. Um, my wife, um, worked for the late Senator Lloyd Benson, who was chairman of Senate Intelligence and Senate Finance. He
Great man.
later ran as vice president, and he was a great man. I covered him. She worked for him, but he'd been a B-17 bomber pilot and stuff, and
Yep.
just he was known as a cloakroom senator in the cloakroom behind the chamber. That's where he got stuff done. He was highly respected, and that's how he got votes. And he was never critical of anybody. None of that. It was never personal. Well, that's all changed. It's like a blood sport up there now. And um, if you're saying nasty things about the other side and other people, how are you ever going to get them to work with you on legislation? And I'm sorry, but politics is the art of compromise.
Well, yeah, but it seems to me that it's turned a little bit more into a sport of mudslinging,
Sure. Yeah.
and and keep your wall up between you and
Mhm.
the other side. That it's just not cool to cross the aisle and shake a hand
Yeah.
and sit down and talk. Uh,
Well,
and
my,
and, and the media, would you say the media has had a large part of that happening?
I think they've been a part of it by focusing on it, making it the focus rather than, you know, nuts and bolts of what's going on in legislation, focusing more on who's up, who's down, and the squabbles. And then we have a situation now where the extreme right and the extreme left of each party control the parties and kind of control the narrative. And it gets all of this attention. And, my wife and I work for Democrats, but we're really moderates now, middle of the road, just to the right. And I mean, it's been presidential election after presidential election. We didn't feel like there was anybody on either side we could get excited about voting for. I just want somebody that can run the government, understands foreign policy, and wants to keep America strong and wants them to create a world. And I think most people feel this way. Will they create, a future in the United States where our children can uh, prosper?
Yeah, and I also feel that that not enough time is being devoted to moving us forward. It's a matter of just
Mm,
squabbling back and forth, and very often my wife and I will look at what is going on in the rhetoric that we see on the broadcast news, and I say to myself, "What's happening with the immigrant children on the border? What's happening over in Ukraine today? Going on in the world because everything
yeah,
seems to be so centralized in their focus and rhetoric that we don't see the big picture that
yeah,
you used to see on the evening news. They would cover so much more.
yes. Now, I will tell you, there are good members there, thoughtful members,
Yes,
that want to be statespeople in both parties. We never get to hear from them. You know, the the media goes after the shrillest, and
sure, and
that's that's part of the
there
kind of
yeah,
part of
there's
the
far
problem.
too many that want to be
Yeah,
in front of the camera. You're right, you talked about the backroom politics when things used to get done because people would sit down in one-on-one and just hash things out until they could come up with some kind of a viable approach. Today, it's like just throw whatever is out there, and the media is waiting outside the
yeah,
door to
yeah.
jump on you.
Well, and the other problem today is that we have social media, and it's toxic. Twitter is toxic. It's the negative rises to the top. Of course, we've learned that the algorithm creates these thought bubbles, and the algorithm feeds this, and the Russians exploited it. Um, so we have that is a factor that's really hurting our system. And I think the Chinese and the Russians, they're delighted at what's going on, and they're manipulating it. I can tell you, I'm part of an FBI group that's from the private sector called InfraGard. It was established after 9/11 to protect infrastructure, and so we all have security clearances and we get briefings, and uh, you know, there there's we're at war every day. And I'll tell you something that I realize is that young kid from East Texas when I got had a security clearance, and I'm seeing cables and other stuff. I was like, oh my God, we're at war here every day. The public never hears about it, but what the bottom line of it is that everybody else wants our stuff. It's that simple. And if they think they can come and take it, they will come and take it. And it's just, it's a hard fact of life. It's humanity. It's difficult for, I think, a lot of people to understand that it comes down to that. If you look at the march of history, same thing has happened. So I covered President Reagan, and I really, especially in hindsight, had respect for, he was trust but verify. He was peace through strength. And same Teddy Roosevelt. And we've kind of gotten away from that. And so people, I'll tell you one thing. I don't think Russia would have done in Ukraine what it's doing now if Ronald Reagan had been president. Wouldn't have happened. Um, or George H.W. Bush.
Mhm.
And I think that's one of my biggest concerns is that the political leadership with their squabbling and other stuff and various presidents they're not sending a message to the world. Don't mess with Texas.
Yeah. Would you agree that cybersecurity is probably the biggest area of concern in our lives today? With regard to what we're doing and how we're doing it and how we are protecting what we're doing.
It's one of the big concerns. I remember uh, there's always somebody trying to break in, no matter what you
Of
build.
course.
That's always going on. And I remember sitting at a conference and I turned to the FBI agent next to me and I said, when I was with the Congressional Committee, maybe it was a lot easier to keep things in locked file drawers in paper. So, but it's just not.
Than on a computer.
Yeah, that's just not the nature of the world. But yeah, it's a major threat, and the damage that it can do. And frankly, many American companies, organizations, even the American government has been lax about all of this. They haven't invested the money in it. They haven't stayed up on top of it. Um, you talk to IT people in companies, they feel they're forgotten. But it is critical. But I also think um, I think what's going on in social media and how it can be manipulated is one of the bigger threats to the company psychologically. Um, Frankly, personally, after everything I've seen, um, I don't believe you should allow anonymity on it. There are too many people smearing people and putting out false information. They don't have to submit to Facebook identification, anything like that. Now, I've got a paid advertising account with Facebook, and I've had to provide them my corporate charter, bank account, passport photos and stuff, but anybody else can go in there and cause mayhem and no consequences.
Well, when you see a report that major governmental agency, I mean, even going as high as, for instance, the Pentagon, that hackers have gotten in and taken compromising information, it's scary. It's very scary, and you wonder how secure is your information. We all walk around with a cell phone in our pockets, and we often keep a lot of very sensitive information in our cell phones. And you realize that, oh, well, no, somebody's got to know my code in order to open up my cell phone to access any of that information. A hacker can get it in moments. And we seem to forget about that. And then this is on a global scale. That's why I mentioned about cybersecurity, because I read an article that it is probably one of the fastest growing college degrees across the country, programs in our colleges for artificial intelligence and cybersecurity, because 20 years from now we're going to need it even more than what we are doing today.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I have two-step verification set up on all my stuff. If I'm going to log into Facebook or LinkedIn, I get a text message on my phone, and I've got to put that code in. So it's an extra step.
Well, back we used to go to the science fiction movies, follow James Bond movies and all, where you'd have to go up and either put your eyeball on a screen in order to get in, or do a thumbprint, or a variety of things, and it was all kind of science fiction and all, and it's today. A lot of the programs we have in our phones are using
Yes.
facial recognition
Right.
to get in.
Right.
And that was all something we thought, oh man, that's really cool, but it'll never happen. But it does happen.
And it's always going to be with us. It's such an integral part of everyone's lives. There's always going to be someone trying to exploit it. But like I say, there's a war there going on all the time.
Well, yes, and while it is happening, as when something is developed, there are bad guys out there that are already on the road to trying to undo that. Takes me back to the first time you went out and bought your first uh, police detector that you used to put
Yeah.
on the dashboard of your car,
Yes.
and all because it would beep whenever there was a policeman nearby. Well, pretty soon the bad guys were finding a way to let the police know how to override your system. So now you had to go out and get the super system in order to do it. So it's always a one-upsmanship.
So it reminds me of this. As a kid, one of my favorite magazines was Mad Magazine.
Oh yeah.
And
Alfred E. Newman.
Alfred E. Newman. But do you remember the ongoing cartoon of Spy versus Spy? And
Yes.
it was this very thing. So yeah.
I'd like to ask a question, because you are an investigative reporter and you dig excuse me, to find your answers. Has there ever been a time or a place, because you've traveled overseas on a lot of your investigative reporting, have you ever felt your life was threatened because you were digging perhaps in places that other people didn't want you to dig?
Yes. And over the course of my career, I received even threats by telephone. Um, you'll even see it. We've got my podcast, True Crime Reporter. The first season, 17 episodes, is about serial killer Kenneth McDuff, who was let out of prison in Texas under a cloud of corruption and then resumed killing again. And when I began digging into corruption in that, and we have a little bit of that in the TV show. Oh boy, yeah, the threats started coming. Uh, the United States Attorney out in Waco wanted to put U.S. Marshals in my home. So yeah, I've had stories. I've had corruption stories where yes, my wife's taken calls. So it has happened. Yes.
The website is going to be scrolling across the screen from time to time, and I urge everybody that is watching and listening to to this show to visit the website, because not only is there very valuable and interesting information about Robert and the things that he's done, but the True Crime Reporter podcast that he is doing is absolutely fascinating. I've had the opportunity to listen to several of the episodes already, and I mean it's like watching a good episode of Dateline or so. The depth that you go in the podcast that you do with Bill Johnston, and also that Freed to Kill, which discusses those that are on death row that continue their crime sprees because they are freed. What was the impetus to get you to go into this area of investigating the Freed to Kill, these serial killers and all? Where in your career did you say, this is something I really want to sink my teeth into?
Well, I had I was a congressional staffer. Went out was a kind of an advanced man in the first Carter presidential campaign. Came out of that and was like, okay, what I want to do, and it was television. So I finally got in. Bob Schieffer of CBS News, a fellow Texan from Fort Worth, gave me an
Yeah.
enormous amount of help and support. And I started in New York covering government, the New York State legislature and stuff, as an investigative reporter. And then went to Washington for WFAA in Dallas, Channel 8 News. In those days, it was like a network. It was a powerhouse. If you wanted to be a correspondent, I remember Schieffer telling me this, said, Robert, if you want to be a correspondent here at CBS or ABC, you need to go to WFAA. They run like a network. That's where we go looking for correspondents. And interestingly, the day that I started at WFAA, Scott Pelley, who was later the anchor of the CBS Evening News, started. It was a great training ground. A lot of money was spent. Great emphasis on excellence. Now all that changed. That doesn't exist anymore. But I was covering the White House, Pentagon, everything. And frankly, I just was burned out. I was tired. And I asked to get reassigned, and I got sent to Austin, where there was a bureau. And I might say during those days, when the legislature was in session, there were bureaus of newspapers and other TV stations around the state. There are none now, nothing.
Yeah.
Nobody, no one's watching. It's all been just gutted. In part because the television, they don't have the revenue they had, but also in part as there was a whole change by the leadership and all of the, well, this stuff isn't important. They just started going cheap, and they didn't want to spend money on digging. But in those days they did. And I arrived, and this is 1990, and one of the things I noticed, that especially in Houston, every day on the news and in the headlines, there were these horrendous stories of violence, and it was stranger on stranger, and buried in the bottom of the story always was an inmate out on early parole. It was kind of a throwaway in there. Of course, I'm new. I'm coming here, and it really and at first I thought, well, is this kind of exploitive journalism where, if it leads, if it bleeds, it leads? And as I dug more, oh no, it was starting in Dallas and Fort Worth.
Right.
And I began talking to a member of the legislature. He was just a little bit older than I, a young guy. He was the chairman of the Senate Criminal Justice Committee. His name was Ted Lyon. And Ted, earlier in his career, had been a police officer and put himself through law school at night. And, we started talking about it, and he had some hearings. And man, I thought the bullshit meter was just redlining during these meters of how these parole board members were explaining why these people were out. They would say, well, they were a model inmate. I don't have a crystal ball. Well, there's no such thing as a model
They
inmate.
found religion. They got their
Yeah.
GED or another degree.
Yeah. Well, and so as I began digging, I discovered that, gosh, upwards of 60 former death row inmates had been let out on parole. And as we dug further, we
Wow.
found out that the administration there, the Clements administration, Republican administration, the last, you'd never think Republicans would do this, but frankly, both parties were guilty. They had defied the federal court judge that was over the Ruiz case about overcrowding. They defied him for 10 years, and instead of building prisons to relieve overcrowding, they did nothing. Meanwhile, if they were all running for reelection as tough on crime, they were passing longer sentences, but they had nowhere to put all these people. And so, to avoid the political embarrassment of a judge taking over, literally in the dead of night, they started releasing 150 inmates a day. And there was a hearing when Lyon kind of broke a member who told the truth and said, we're at the bottom of the barrel. And so I started digging into my stuff and looking into who are these people that have gotten out and how did they get out. And one of them was Kenneth Allen McDuff. He had randomly murdered 3 teenagers in Fort Worth in the 1960s. Horrendous crime, shocked everybody. And he'd been sentenced to put on death row. But what happened in 1972? The Supreme Court struck down the death penalty,
Right. Right.
and um, all of these inmates on death row around the country, their sentences were commuted to life. They became eligible for parole. But who would imagine that anybody in their right mind would let them out? But what happened was a combination of the overcrowding, also a combination of corruption, of taking money. And that's what I began to uncover. And found, a member of the family told me that McDuff's family had allegedly paid 25 grand to get him out. The day after he walked out of prison, he started killing again. And I mean, he left a string of victims up and down Interstate 35, here in Texas, into Mexico. We'll never know how many. Um, I actually had help from one of the original FBI profilers, Bill Hazelwood, who was an amazing agent, who helped me. And he said, you've got your hands here on what I classify as the great white shark of serial killers. He's a sadistic sexual serial killer in that his pleasure is the suffering, keeping them alive and suffering hour after hour is control and pain. And that was McDuff. And ironically, as I'm doing reporting, I'm breaking stories, and there are hearings going on in the state capitol about all of these guys that are out, including McDuff. McDuff is cruising with accomplices blocks from the Capitol in Austin to get victims, and does abduct a young accountant right after Christmas, plain sight from a car wash, never to be seen alive again. And it always gets me to this day. We were putting it all out there to the parole board, but it was just corrupt. And did anybody say, "Oh, we need to go find out where these people are. What are they doing?" Oh, no. They were up, as I say in the podcast and in the television show, they were freed to kill, and they did. And it resulted in one of the biggest. Ann Richards then inherited this problem,
Right.
and it resulted in the biggest prison expansion in the history of the state. And Ann Richards was a liberal Democrat. No way did she come into office saying, I'm going to build prisons. But to her credit, she did, led by Senator Lyon. But we're back. We've forgotten the lessons of history. We're back into this situation today around the country with these liberal release and bail policies where violent offenders with gun crimes are walking out, some on personal recognizance, which means, I promise to show up. And they're recommitting. And so Houston is really bad. But I can tell you, parts of Dallas, Houston, Austin, New York City, they're dangerous places. You just don't know it.
And you obviously see these things from a different perspective than most people do. And I was unaware of stuff, and the general public is probably unaware of these people that are being released in order to carry on where they left off.
Yeah, I like to say McDuff was probably one of the worst serial killers in U.S. history, and you've never heard of him.
Yeah, I mean we're familiar with the Charles Mansons and those because they got a lot of the media attention and all.
Yeah.
But it's boy.
Well, what I during that investigation, I spent 10 years of my life on it. I was in because it spread everywhere, and I probably was in every maximum security prison in the state of Texas, talking to inmates, others. Heck, one of my this always blows people's minds. One of my best sources about the corruption of what was going on was the hitman for the Aryan Brotherhood, if you can imagine that. So, I developed a network of sources in the prison system that really helped with it. But in the beginning, the threats came out of the prison system in that because of the corruption, everybody thought, hey, my day's coming. We're going to pay. I got a ticket out of here. And when I started doing the reporting, that ended. Oh, it shut it down. And then they were mad at Robert. Then later, to my good fortune, McDuff became the poster boy for all of these issues from my reporting. And then everybody in the prison system wanted to kill him when he came back. He had to stay in until he was executed, stay in solitary and other stuff. But the one thing I've learned, and I think that people don't realize, you would realize it if you were ever sat in a court hearing with a very violent criminal, serial killer and stuff. What you'd learn is evil, Old Testament evil walks amongst us. It really does. And it doesn't look evil. Looks like the old guy next door. I'm telling you, if you were standing in line with McDuff at the checkout counter, he's a big guy, but he didn't come across as threatening. But then when you see the mug shots and the stuff after he's arrested, oh boy, does he look spooky. But I can tell you, in civilian clothes and all, he looked kind of big, goofy guy until that other part turned on. And then there was he had a certain type of woman he was after, petite, brown hair, that he could control. And boy, then when that turned on, he was a shark.
It's borderline chilling, Robert. And to think that you have made your really life focus out of investigative reporting, and now doing these podcasts, which I think are, again, folks, go to the website and follow. I just signed up to receive your posts about things that are going on and new reports that are coming out. It's well worth signing up because it's you're an incredible person. I wish we had another hour to talk. And I've taken up a lot of your valuable time, and we've barely scratched the surface.
Well, I'm fine, but I would say for listeners who are concerned about public safety, and I always worry about the young people, and there's no better example than the murders in Idaho. And we've got an episode where I've got a fugitive hunter homicide detective and we break down that arrest warrant to explain, here's how they did it, here's what he was doing, and to bring an understanding. One of the things we want to do with our episodes, we want to help educate.
Right.
And if you listen to that episode and you've got a son or daughter in college or young, adult out starting in the workplace in a city, there are lessons there. There are lessons about being aware of your surroundings and understanding there is evil out there. You can't go around all the time looking over your shoulder, but you have to be careful. You got to be aware. But the people don't see what I see, and some of the episodes with me are done by Bill Johnston, a former U.S. attorney. Bill prosecuted the parole board chairman out of the McDuff case. It was corrupt. He also started the manhunt for McDuff when no one else would.
Yeah.
And he's prosecuted cartel members, you name it. He's done it all. So you got an interesting perspective from both of us that you don't get anywhere else. And frankly, I don't like most true crime podcasts. Or people are doing it. They have no experience. I feel some of it is exploitive. I always want to say,
Sure,
you're kind of giggly about this, but someone died here and they've got family left out here. So we try to do a balance. You'll hear inmates on my podcast. I've got a episode coming up of a Major League Baseball player, successful 14 years. Gets a drinking problem, which leads to other ills, and he ends up spending 3.5 years in the Texas penitentiary, and that's not a good place to go, believe me. And we're going to hear his story and kind of how he remade himself.
Well, we as I say, we have just barely scratched the surface of your career, and I'm going to reach out to you in the future, and maybe we'll do another session because some of the work that you've done investigating Congress, domestic and international terrorism, there's an awful lot of things to still discuss. So, would you come back for another show?
Oh, I'd love to. And one of the subjects people ask me to speak on sometimes is entrepreneurship of
Okay.
how did you get here? And so in 2008, when I got cut, the recession, thousands of news people were cut overnight. And
Yeah.
so it was suddenly like, uh-oh, I got two kids in college. How am I going to do this? How do I run a business? How do and I've, I like to say I've got a PhD in the School of Hard Knocks of content entrepreneurship. Yeah. And I do. There are a lot of people out there today that are ready to, they're tired of the corporate gig and they want to try to have control of their lives. And
Exactly.
but there's a path to that. You really need to think it out.
Yeah. Well, Robert, thank you again for being a guest on Someone You Should Know. I end my show by saying, "Be yourself because everyone else is already taken," and I think you understand what I'm saying when I say that.
Oh yes.
So thank you again very very much, Robert Riggs. Someone You Should Know. See you all again next week for another episode. Take care.
Someone